Frank Peterson sat in the sterile doctor's office, staring blankly at the paper in his hand. The doctor's voice echoed in his head. 6 months, maybe a year. Cancer. It had spread too far to be stopped. At 62 years old, Frank's life was reduced to a countdown. For years, he had chased success, sacrificing relationships in the process. Now, with limited time left, he realized the price he had paid. He was alone. Divorced, estranged from his children, no close friends to turn to. That night, Frank lay awake in his empty apartment, staring at the ceiling. His regrets washed over him like a tidal wave. All the people he had hurt, pushed away, and abandoned over the years. It was all so clear now, but maybe, just maybe, there was still time to make amends. He couldn't change the past, but he could seek forgiveness. It was his last wish. The next morning, Frank packed a suitcase and set out on a journey. His first stop was a small town 3 hours away, where his old college roommate, Greg, lived. They hadn't spoken in over 2 decades after a bitter falling out. Greg had trusted Frank with a business deal, but Frank had betrayed him for personal gain. As he pulled up to Greg's house, memories of their friendship came flooding back, but so did the guilt. When Greg opened the door, his face was a mix of shock and hesitation. Frank stood there, struggling to find the words. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I was selfish. I was wrong to betray you. I need you to know that." Greg stared at him for a long moment. "I was angry for years, Frank. What you did hurt me deeply, but holding on to that anger didn't make my life better. I've moved on." Frank's shoulders sagged in relief. They sat on the porch, talking for hours, reminiscing about their younger days. As they laughed and shared memories, Frank felt a weight lift from his chest. He hadn't realized just how much guilt he'd been carrying all these years. When he left, Greg hugged him tightly, and Frank drove away feeling lighter. But he knew the hardest part of his journey was yet to come. His next stop was his daughter, Emily. They hadn't spoken in years. Their relationship had always been strained, but the final break came when she was 20 and left home after a terrible argument. Frank had been too focused on his work, too hard on her, and too blind to see how much it hurt her. As he pulled into her driveway, his hands trembled. He hadn't seen her in nearly a decade. Would she even want to see him now? Emily opened the door cautiously. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw her father standing there. "Dad?" she asked, uncertain. "Hi, Emily," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "I came to apologize. For everything. I was a terrible father. I put my work ahead of you, ahead of our family. I didn't listen. I didn't care enough. And I know I can't make up for that, but I want you to know that I'm sorry." Emily looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Frank held his breath, waiting for her to slam the door or tell him to leave. But instead, she stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. They sat down in the living room, the silence heavy between them. "You hurt me, Dad," Emily finally said, her voice soft. "I spent so many years wondering why I wasn't enough for you, why your job was more important than me. I was angry for a long time, but I've grown up and I've moved on. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just sad." Frank's heart broke as he listened to his daughter's words. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I wish I could go back and do it all differently. But all I can ask for now is your forgiveness." Emily sighed. "I don't know if I can forgive you, at least not right away, but I'm willing to try." Frank nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. It wasn't the forgiveness he had hoped for, but it was a start. As they talked, he realized that forgiveness wasn't something that could happen in an instant. It would take time, and that was something he had very little of. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. After spending the evening with his daughter, Frank decided to stay in town for a few days. They didn't resolve everything, but it was a step toward healing. They walked through the park together, talking about Emily's life, her career, and the grandchildren Frank had never met. Each moment felt bittersweet, but he knew he was lucky to have these days with her. They weren't just reconnecting, They were starting to rebuild a relationship that had been broken for too long. Over the next few weeks, Frank continued his journey, visiting old friends and family members. One stop was to visit his younger brother Dave. They had grown apart after their parents' death, and Frank had avoided him for years, using work as an excuse. Dave was shocked to see him after so much time. The brothers sat in the backyard, reminiscing about their childhood, and Frank admitted how his pride had kept them apart. Dave forgave him quickly, and they spent a few days enjoying each other's company. They realized they still had a bond that time and distance couldn't fully erase. Frank also made a trip to visit an old colleague, Sarah, who had once been his closest friend at work. He had taken credit for one of her ideas years ago, and it had led to a promotion for him and a dead end for her. She had left the company not long after, but Frank had never tried to make it right. When he finally admitted his wrongs, Sarah was surprised, but she smiled and told him, "I let that go a long time ago, Frank. You don't need to carry that anymore." With each apology, Frank found a piece of himself he had lost. It wasn't always easy. Some people weren't ready to forgive, and others didn't want to see him at all. But Frank learned that forgiveness wasn't just about asking for it. It was about giving it too. Along the way, he forgave himself for his mistakes, for the years he had wasted chasing things that didn't matter. He realized that while he couldn't fix everything, he could still make peace with the past. One day, after weeks of travel, Frank found himself sitting on a quiet beach, watching the waves crash against the shore. He had come to terms with the fact that he wouldn't be able to fix everything. Some relationships were too broken to be repaired, and some wounds were too deep to heal completely. But what mattered was that he had tried. He had faced his mistakes, owned up to his wrongs, and sought forgiveness. Whether he received it or not was out of his control. That as he sat there, a sense of peace washed over him. His body was weak, the cancer taking its toll, but his soul felt lighter than it had in years. In the end, forgiveness wasn't just about the other person, it was about setting himself free. Frank smiled to himself as the sun set on the horizon, knowing that he had done what he needed to do. His journey had come to an end, but in seeking forgiveness, he had found something even more valuable: peace.